This is a poster from the United Nations Public Information Office, produced in February of 1961. Let's have a look. It's got lots of flags, and I must admit, I do love flags. Besides the UN flag itself, there are flags from each and every country which was a United Nations member at the time, 99 in total, and it includes several flags from countries which no longer exist today, like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and the United Arab Republic. But this poster also shows flags from two countries which didn't actually exist in 1961, at least they didn't exist as independent countries, not yet anyway, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. These were, at the time, both parts of the Soviet Union, a country which was divided up into republics, in the same way that the United States is made up of 50 individual states. But bizarrely, the Soviet Union is also listed as a UN member, so it's very much like seeing Florida and New Jersey listed as members of the UN alongside the US. Actually, that would be really bizarre. I can only imagine what the UN ambassadors from Florida or New Jersey would be like. But both of these countries, these two Soviet socialist republics, did later declare independence during the collapse of the Soviet Union, as Belarus and Ukraine respectively. But this did not happen until 1991, 30 years after this poster was printed. Surely Ukraine and Belarus could not have somehow become members of the United Nations, a club which is meant to be formed of exclusively sovereign states, before either actually became independent. But the answer is no, this poster was not a mistake. It merely reflects a largely forgotten bit of geopolitical horse trading which took place in the closing days of World War II, and which, decades later, I would argue contributed to the fall of a superpower, and that still reverberates today. Hi, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and welcome to another edition of Strange Politics. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please let me know in the comments, and please be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Finding Ukraine and Belarus on this 1961 poster of UN members may look strange, but as I said, it was not a mistake. Ukraine and Belarus were fully fledged members of the United Nations at the time, despite neither being independent countries. They weren't even close to being independent, actually. The Soviet Union was a dictatorship, and the different republics which made up the Soviet Union had zero real autonomy, and were obliged to follow all orders from the central government in Moscow. Just to prove to you that this poster isn't an anomaly, here's another one with a similar concept from the early 1950s. It shows the flags of the Belarusian SSR and the Ukrainian SSR, although with earlier versions of their flags. And here's the thing. Belarus and Ukraine weren't just members of the UN. Believe it or not, they were both original members, alongside the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, Australia, and the Soviet Union. And in fact, these two Soviet republics are listed among the first 29 members of the UN when it was founded on the 24th of October, 1945. To understand how this happened, we have to examine the very origins of the United Nations, which took place in the closing stages of World War II. In February 1945, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met in secret at a palace near the Black Sea resort of Yalta in present-day Ukraine. Germany had not yet been defeated. That was another 3 months away, but things were looking hopeful for the Allies. These three leaders, arguably the three most powerful men in the world, came together to discuss what would happen once the war was over. President Roosevelt was very keen for the Soviet Union to join a new, worldwide international organization he proposed creating, which he was calling the United Nations. His hope was that the UN could prevent future wars, and to do this effectively, he was convinced that all major powers needed to be part of it, including the Soviet Union. But when it came to this new United Nations thing, Stalin didn't exactly trust Roosevelt's or Churchill's motives. He was worried that it might just be a mechanism for trying to control the Soviets. That's the thing with brutal dictators, they tend not to be overly trusting. To reassure Stalin and get him on board, Roosevelt and Churchill made two concessions. One was that the Soviets, as well as the US, the UK, China, and France, would get a veto on the UN Security Council, the most powerful part of the UN. This meant the UN would never be able to do anything important that the Soviets didn't like. But Stalin also wanted something else. He wanted the Soviet Union to have some extra clout in the General Assembly. the part of the UN where every member country gets one vote. The General Assembly isn't nearly as powerful as the Security Council, but it's not exactly nothing either. And so, despite Ukraine and Belarus being part of the Soviet Union, not separate countries, both Churchill and Roosevelt agreed that they could join the UN as full members alongside the Soviet Union, which is kind of confusing. Actually, according to some research I found, the Soviets had previously proposed that every one of the 16 republics in the Soviet Union, and yes, there were 16 of them at the time, look it up, be admitted as full members of the UN. By the time of the Yalta conference, Stalin realized he was going to have to settle for far fewer than 16, and so he asked for 3 republics to be admitted. Besides Ukraine and Belarus, he was also lobbying for Lithuania. He argued that these 3 republics had suffered greatly during the conflict, which was true, and that their people deserved UN membership as some sort of reward or something. Being good diplomats, Roosevelt and Churchill went along with this excuse, but only for Belarus and Ukraine. In the minutes from the Yalta conference, which are now publicly available, Churchill reportedly said that he supported membership for these 2 because of their, quote, martyrdom and sufferings. Don't get me wrong, the people of Ukraine and Belarus did suffer terribly during World War II. But I don't think getting membership in the United Nations under false pretenses was something that anyone in these countries actually cared about. But it did get Stalin to agree to join the UN, and that was the point. So anyway, when representatives from 48 countries gathered in San Francisco 2 months later to draft the UN Charter, officially at least, there were 50 countries, because they counted Ukraine and Belarus. They even let the head of the Ukrainian delegation, Dmitry Manuilsky, chair the committee which drafted the preamble and first chapter of the UN Charter. And I'm mentioning that mostly because I wanted to include this picture, because I think it's funny. So you might be wondering, was the fact that neither Ukraine nor Belarus were independent a problem for anyone? I mean, was everyone in the UN just happy to pretend that this was okay? And the answer is yes. Everyone was just happy to go along with it, although the Soviet Union did arrange a bit of legal cover to try and make the setup seem a bit less ridiculous. You see, what makes a country fully independent, and not just part of another country, is not something that everyone agrees on. But there are 2 things pretty much everyone thinks every fully independent country should have, and these are control of foreign policy, including the right to agree treaties with other countries, and the right to have a military to defend yourself from attack. So if you take Greenland, for example, it is fully self-governing in most ways, but it doesn't have its own foreign policy or military. These 2 things are still controlled by Denmark. And so, while everyone considers Greenland to be pretty cool, no one thinks of it as an independent country. Not yet, anyway. So if Ukraine and Belarus were going to pose as independent countries, they needed to at least appear to have control over these 2 things. And it just so happened that in 1944, about the time Stalin began suggesting that some Soviet republics should start being given full memberships at the UN, the Soviet Constitution was amended. It now said, each Union Republic has the right to enter into direct relations with foreign states, to conclude agreements with them, and exchange diplomatic and consular representatives with them. And each Union Republic has its republican military formation. Both of these are slightly convoluted ways of saying, officially at least, that every Soviet republic could conduct its own foreign policy and have its own military. And at the same time that these amendments were pushed through, similar language was added to the constitutions of each of the member republics, just to make it 100% official. Of course, this was a total sham. Ukraine and Belarus did set up their own foreign ministries, but they only engaged with the United Nations and with UN-affiliated organizations. They didn't set up embassies in any other countries, not even with each other. Their foreign ministries existed exclusively for engaging with the UN. And of course, neither Ukraine nor Belarus actually ever set up their own military while they were part of the Soviet Union. They had the right to set one up, at least on paper, but just chose not to. Or at least, that's what they would have said if you'd asked them at the time. Also, I have to admit, the issue of full independence was clouded by 2 other original UN members, which were still not yet fully independent at the time that the UN was formed, India and the Philippines. The Philippines was in the final stage of a decade-long transition to independence from the United States, which was completed by the next year. Likewise, there was India, which had been slowly edging towards full independence for years. This was finally granted 2 years later in 1947. But unlike the Philippines and India, Belarus and Ukraine had zero real autonomy and zero chance of ever becoming independent. Or at least, that's what most people thought at the time. But anyway, everyone played along with the fiction that Belarus and Ukraine were not part of the Soviet Union, at least when it came to UN stuff. Besides having 2 extra seats in the General Assembly, including Ukraine and Belarus as members brought the Soviets a few extra perks which were not immediately obvious. Both countries were members of various UN agencies, like the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, and the International Atomic Energy Association, which meant that the Soviet Union had extra votes in these bodies too, and that was nice. And, as regular UN members, both Ukraine and Belarus were eligible to serve on the extremely powerful Security Council, not as permanent members with veto rights, but just as normal members, serving 2-year terms. This happened on 3 occasions, 1948 to 49, 1974 to 75, and 1984 to 85. Being on the Security Council, even as a non-permanent member, is a big deal, and it was a significant advantage for the Soviets when this happened. So, for several decades, things just ticked along, and as far as anyone knew, the Soviet Union was set to keep going forever, and the pretend sovereignty of Ukraine and Belarus seemed pretty inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Right? No. Although no one could really see it yet, this little fiction which Stalin had concocted, merely to gain a slight advantage at the UN, ended up hastening the demise of the Soviet Union, and I would argue, still has repercussions today. So let's fast forward a few decades and see what happened. When the dictatorial regime which ran the Soviet Union started teetering in the late 1980s, the extensive series of legal fictions that had built up around itself over decades began producing unintended consequences. Parliaments, which had always done as they were told, suddenly started passing legislation without permission. Elections, which had always been rigged in advance, suddenly became somewhat genuine. And the many fictional powers granted to the various Soviet republics started seeming a lot less fictional. Starting with Lithuania in March 1990, each Soviet republic began declaring itself independent, one by one. At first, it was far from clear that these acts had any real meaning. After all, lots of dictatorial regimes collapse without their realms splitting into multiple parts. Initially, the Soviet central government did what it could to make sure these attempts at independence failed, and most political observers assumed that the central government would regain control eventually. But when it came time for Belarus and Ukraine to assert their independence, they were starting off with a genuine ace in the hole: United Nations membership. Most countries pushing for independence see UN membership as the final step in a quest for worldwide recognition. Ukraine and Belarus were starting with UN membership before they'd even taken their first step towards freedom. It's hard to overstate how unusual this is, or what a huge advantage it was for the 2 new governments. To give you an analogy, it's like playing Fortnite and finding a legendary assault rifle right at your feet as you hit the ground. Yes, there are still other useful items to be had, but you're starting off with the most prized asset of all. To get admitted to the UN in a normal situation, a country needs to get approval from the Security Council, which means not getting vetoed by any of the permanent members. Since the Soviet Union was a permanent member in 1991 and was still scrambling to hold itself together, it would almost certainly have vetoed any application for membership from any of its member republics. But when Ukraine declared independence on August 24, 1991, it didn't need to apply for membership to the UN. It already had it. The permanent representative to the United Nations from the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Hennady Yudovenko, merely sent a letter to the UN Secretary General of the day, Javier Pérez de Cuellar. It said that the country he represented was no longer the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and from now on was simply Ukraine. And that was that. And there was nothing the Soviet Union could do about this either. Belarus and Ukraine had been members of the UN for decades. The unraveling of the Soviet Union was a complex process, but it's impossible to deny that having 2 republics already recognized as members of the international community contributed to the unraveling. But the long-time UN membership of Ukraine also plays a part, at least I think it does, in one of the thorniest geopolitical issues of the present day: Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory. This is a complex subject, but I want to focus on just one part of it: Crimea. This peninsula in the Black Sea was part of Ukraine when the Soviet Union collapsed. But despite this, in 2014, Russia sent in its military and, very controversially, soon after declared Crimea to be part of Russia. One of the many reasons that Russia argues that this was legitimate is that Crimea had been part of Russia in the distant past. This is true. In the Soviet Union, Crimea was in fact part of the Russian Soviet Republic until 1954. But in February of that year, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union transferred Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Russian nationalists like to argue that this transfer did not follow correct procedure, that the Presidium did not have a full quorum when it took its vote, that the Russian Republic was not consulted, and on and on and on. But I say, when the Soviet Union transferred territory to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, this was an agreement between two UN member states. It was, in effect, an international treaty of sorts. And I think that should trump everything else. What's more, when Russia was admitted to the UN, it inherited the valuable benefits which had previously belonged to the Soviet Union, most notably permanent member status on the Security Council. In exchange for this, Russia agreed to accept responsibility for the Soviet Union's international obligations and agreements. To me, this means if Russia wants to consider itself a legitimate United Nations member, it must accept the Soviet Union's decision to transfer Crimea to Ukraine, a transfer of territory from one UN member to another, and return Crimea to Ukrainian control immediately. Sure, it's far from normal for an internal transfer of territory to involve two sovereign UN members, but that's another bit of Soviet policy which Russia should be agreeing to accept responsibility for. Don't like it? It's not Ukraine's fault. Go blame Stalin. Thanks for watching. Did you know about Ukraine and Belarus joining the UN in 1945? Do you agree that this contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union? And do you think this has any bearing on the current situation in Crimea? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.